Good morning on that note of everybody being everywhere. Good morning, good evening to everybody calling from all over the world, which is just, I don't know, it's such a privilege to be able to speak to people at the same time all over the world. One of the advantages of this ghastly pandemic. And the other thing is that we get to, have Abe with us from wherever we are, zoomed into our homes. So thank you so much for joining us again, which is for our second virtual meeting with Abe. He took us on a wonderful tour last week of his work through a neuro-dyslexic, a neuro-diverse lens. We immensely enjoyed that. Today, we're very much looking forward to something like a roundtable discussion to encourage and explore neurodiverse approaches to design and architecture. Abe, I'm sure, will share his own experience of being a neurodyslexic designer and his work. And this workshop will very much celebrate and think about the importance of making mistakes and losing the fear of coming at things from a different angle. Which are Abe's words to me when we talked about what he was going to do today. So those two things I think are going to be very important. Two things I'd like to note while we've got everybody here. Two resources at the AA. There's a virtual, what's it called, a virtual salon run by a gentleman called Gil Gershoni. And these salons take place, I think they've been taking place for about a year, 6 months or a year now.
More like 6 months.
More like 6 months. And one of the things to come out of them is this book called The Illustrated Guide to Dyslexia and Its Amazing People by Kate Power. And the AA's...
Just to clarify, I think the book came first, and then the salon is in response to the book.
Oh, thank you, Abe. Thanks. So yes, this book has come out. Just wanted to let everybody know that the AA Library has got a copy of this book. It's a visual guide. We've got an e-book. We've also got a hard copy book for when we can be in the library. So it's called. I can put a link in the chat if people are interested. So the Illustrated Guide to Dyslexia and Its Amazing People. I think your dad, Abe, has got a foreword in the book.
He has a full, and then I think in the first version he's got a chapter as well, a page as well.
Okay, fantastic. So that's available.
I'm so dyslexic. I'm the only one to appear in both books of a page.
That's the advantage of being extra dyslexic.
Exactly. I like to say
that's even hard to say, that extra dyslexic.
I think.
So that resource is there, ebook in the library for everybody. Secondly, just one thing I came across a couple of weeks ago. There's a company in the UK called Lex Academic, and they offer a proofreading and an editing service specifically for students with dyslexia who are writing theses and longer pieces of master's writing. So if anybody wants to find out more about Lex Academic, email me in the Writing Centre and I can put you in touch with them. It's a really, that just is a fantastic service for students who are really trying to pull their, as Abe was talking about last week, writing 50,000, 5,000 words, whatever it is that you have to put together. It's specifically tailored to students with dyslexia. On that note, we welcome Abe again. Very much look forward to what he's going to do today and what we're going to do together. And I'll hand over to him.
Yes, I don't know what we're going to do together today, I suppose. I think the idea was maybe to talk a little bit about what we said last week, to try to open the conversation up to the students as much as possible, maybe to talk about some specific projects in a sort of crit situation. I'll have to say this will be the first virtual crit I've done. But I think you must be doing them all the time at the AA, I imagine. And maybe, to talk briefly about about dyslexia within the industry, I suppose. It's interesting to see Displer is here, muted. And I don't know if you know about them. They're a very interesting dyslexic operation, producing very fantastic filmic material. So I didn't realize it was open so wide. So it'll be interesting to hear from them. And where was I? What were we talking about last week? So I think the salon was very interesting to speak with many different dyslexics about their very different ways of the neurodiverse affecting their work. So the last salon that I did was with a dancer, a surgeon, And it's very, what was so captivating is this whole thing of getting in the zone, I suppose, the chef. So when I think part of the journey of the spectrum is to be able to filter out other stuff and just go into these kind of super focused zones, where it becomes instinctive rather than being driven. So I think at a certain point we're questioning things, how to do something. Should it be red? Should it be rough? Should it be long, thin, whatever? And I think when we fall into a depth, suddenly we no longer question. We're just moving into a process of seeing and knowing, and this inner confidence that comes out because it's about getting into this zone. I think in the I Ching they call it wuxia, I think, which starts to define this moment where we no longer where we know the environment so well. So mountain climbers talk about it when climbing, but it's very interesting to see this brilliant dyslexic surgeon. And I always think there's something funny about a dyslexic surgeon, because architects, everyone checks our drawings, but when you're cutting someone's flesh, no one's checking anything. And he's an amazing surgeon and incredibly successful, but it's not necessarily an area that you would expect to find. You would expect to find a dyslexic. And then there was a really interesting dyslexic dancer who talks about, again, getting into the zone and losing herself in her mind and being able to see the dance moves and the choreography that she's doing before she does it. Or an actor who really struggles to learn his lines, but once he can really inhale the character, he can then really become the character. So I suppose what this is really teaching me is that, like with all these things, it doesn't prevent you doing anything, but it's finding the way to translate it and to find the strengths and to use those strengths to counterbalance the weaknesses or to overcome the weaknesses. But the strengths are so much more powerful than the weaknesses. So it's really trying to push that and to celebrate that. So often it might be that I think if I was to look at my dad's practice, for example, and in some ways my own practice, I think whereas Renzo Piano could sit on an island by himself and he could design the perfect building, he is someone that could do everything in a way. I think as dyslexics, often we need to build teams around us. Now, the dancer and the surgeon, that's a slightly different situation. But as architects, I've noticed from my observations of people that I know that we become much more about a team collective, because it's about all these different skills and needing these different skills. And that certainly was what kind of drove Richard, was to bring in all these, and he would edit everyone's ideas. He's the architect who never drew. He sketched, but no one ever saw his drawings weren't part of the processes, and his words were much more important to an extent. And it's the role of the editor, of the politician, of the campaigner, of the culture that he would bring to the office. And likewise with my studio, I have a writer who translates my writings, and we work together to create our own language. I do draw obsessively, but very badly, and I don't very often publish that part of my process. But I draw as a process of often the same thing again and again, as a process of distilling my ideas. And then I have Yoski-san, who I've worked together for 12 years, who takes my ideas and certainly doesn't copy them, but he uses them as a starting point. And then it becomes a game of ping pong, of bouncing ideas back and forth. And I'm very much of the belief that more minds make more interesting solutions. So by building these tensions and pushing these different directions and using these very different types of minds. So Philippa, my co-writer, she remembers every name in the world, and she has access to all these things that I'm always losing. But I have a fluency and a confidence that she doesn't. And so together we create this collaboration, and we form, which I think has become quite an interesting language. So I suppose that is the starting point of this perspective. So I think I would quite like, having done a good hour and a half manic talk last week, I think it'd be quite good to try and turn it back to the audience to see what they want to say, and particularly if Displa wants to say something coming from another very different professional position. So I don't know how we do this. We put hands up, or if anyone wants to show some work and talk about that as well, what we mentioned last week would also be really interesting.
Yes, probably the best way to do it, Abe, is if people put out, I reiterate, we'd love to hear from Displa if they'd like to speak. And if people want to put their hands up, then I can give the mic to them. Displa, let's hear from you first.
Hello, and hello, Abe. Thanks for that call out for us. I guess I wanted to come on here and listen to all you guys purely to talk about the idea of intuition and how intuition affects your design and creation. And I guess also the relationship between design rules and I guess the breaking of those rules, and the breaking of those rules depending on intuitive thoughts and intuitive feelings when you're creating. But that's our main interest in terms of our research at the moment.
I don't know, one of the things I always feel as a dyslexic is a complete lack of boundaries. So as far as when you stop working and when you start working, as being one rule. And I don't really, I think all the time, I'm like you, I'm sure. So there's not a clock off, clock on situation, but also rules within building typologies or materials. I don't really understand rules, and I never have. I think it's why there are so many dyslexics in prisons as well, possibly, because of the lack of understanding of rules. And it's an unfortunate predicament to be in. But yes, but I mean, do you use rules much?
Yeah, I mean,
in the films?
Sure. I mean, there's a sort of a huge amount of things that we need to adhere to when we're creating something for other people to watch. When we're currently doing this research into what we're coining the neurodivergent aesthetic, which is obviously just an aesthetic based on the neurology of different types of thinking. So obviously you could have something like the ADHD aesthetic, the dyslexic aesthetic, the autistic aesthetic, and so on, which might not be a strictly visual aesthetic, but is definitely a transcendental aesthetic, something that is an aesthetic based on feeling, which we're at the real beginning stages of looking into this idea, but we think it's cool and it sounds cool. And it's another way to frame neurodivergence, something which is usually considered a disability. So we're looking at that from that angle. So in terms of rules and keeping to structures, we kind of believe the aesthetic is something that's comes from, obviously how someone thinks, and whether or not society's blocks make you think in a certain way and deviate from what's your intuitive thinking. Just intuition is a huge part of this. And I guess, how does each one of you, I guess to everyone who sort of creates, how does your intuition guide, and can you compare that to how the rules that you have to adhere to guide you?
For me, intuition is the most important thing in the creative process, and it is that makes our work individual to an extent. I think that is, and I think the notion that you start to talk about aesthetic is really interesting, because I really believe aesthetics is much more than how things look. It's how they feel, how they smell, and I think part of being dyslexic is really engaging in all the senses, mm-hmm. and how we work and we see, becoming much more multi-sensual to an extent as in a desire. And I would say in the same way that I think aesthetic is much more than just how something looks, I think tactility also becomes much more is more than how that something feels. And it's trying to really turn up these sensory engagements, whether it's filmic or whether it is a space or whether it's a piece of clothing. I think it comes across in all these disciplines, or a performance for that matter. A very powerful visual, you can start to imagine how it would smell, and you can start to imagine how the clothes in that film, that warmth, feel. I don't know another great dyslexic, Steve McQueen, and Lovers Rock. I don't know how many of you saw that in the Small Axe series, but I found that film so sensual, in engaging all the senses far beyond. You can only see and hear the film, but it builds such a picture that you can start to really imagine how it smells and the feeling of those clothes and the sensations of touch in the kind of crazy dance scenes.
Sure. No, totally. I felt exactly the same with that. The extended dance scenes, it's something that's not, again, in terms of adhering to rules, especially on the BBC, you've got sort of a platform where everyone has to adhere to very strict rules. And in I think the 5 films he's made, they kind of deviate between being sort of a classical narrative to being more of obviously an art house narrative, which especially in that particular episode, with the extended dance scenes, they sort of completely deviate from what you usually see on TV. Which was kind of wonderful. I was hoping for a bit more of that, a bit more of some deviation, I guess. From
maybe the interest with the play between the two sides. You know, the first one is so linear and so conformist from a sort of filmic perspective, and then you go into Lovers Rock. That's a really powerful narrative, but the narrative is almost told through a piece of. I would go beyond art house. It almost feels like video art. You know, it's really it's just emotion.
Yeah. No, totally. And I guess that's another thing is that sort of, how does that translate? Because I guess everything that you design, everything that you create is all an expression of how we feel as humans. Basically putting across that idea of sort of whatever we want, or the audience or the person walking through the space or whatever, how that we want them to feel. And so we're translating that emotional feeling to something physical, or in Steve McQueen's in his craft onto screen, using
it's physical. I find that is physical. Our response is physical, so it is physical.
Sure. And I guess that makes me think about synesthesia as well, in terms of how you create and how you see things. When I'm creating a piece of work, obviously, sort of like most people, I have to find the nugget of the idea that creates everything else and makes. Yeah, absolutely, sure. And so from that, everything else grows. And when I look back at my piece of work, it's a 3D physical object. It's something with spikes and round bits and all this other bit. And I might have created a piece of film or an audio work or maybe a 360 VR piece. But it still has this idea in my head that I can look around it, and it has all these jaggedy bits, and those jaggedy bits might relate to words or feelings or whatever. But that aspect is, I believe, is kind of my visual interpretation of my intuition of how I see the piece, which I always thought was quite interesting. I was wondering as well if that relates to the stuff you do, Ab. So Abe, where you, with something, like you said before, it extends from something that's physically created. How does it emotionally affect you? Or how does that physical wall that you've created, how else do you see that in terms of taste, sense, smell, emotion, and so on?
I'm doing a little visual essay at the moment for Maggie's, for Quadrat's website based on Maggie's. And we're trying to distill the Maggie's project down to 12 words and 12 images. And each word has an extended caption. But they end up being words like red, like wood, but also words like intimate, like emotional, to start to convey the project. Nurturing, I've just got the file here. Hand, everywhere the building, you're confronted by the touch, by the hand, from the collection of eclectic books, carefully curated objects, the glazed terracotta lights, artistic inventions like Sarah Finelli's glass, So it's getting, nurturing, communal. We're trying to provoke these spirits, intimate, emotional, tactile, porous, sun, perennial, terracotta, walnut, red. So it's trying to look at both the materials that go to make the building, and they're very specific, and then to look at the emotions as almost, I'm really interested as a diagram of creativity, the tartan, because you have the vertical pillars and then you have the horizontal joists, if you like to be very architectural. And it's those crossovers between the materials and the emotions that I find so interesting, like those intersections and those parts.
Yeah, sure.
I think the advantage to the process that we're talking about, and this, I think, synesthesia is a very important word, but it's the ability to get lost inside our own heads, or to be very happy inside our own heads, playing with visions. We may not be able to find the order to put the letters on the piece of paper, but we can build worlds, be it the world of a person's body in the surgeon, or the space for dance, or the architecture or the film. But we can build our worlds and then inhabit them. Sorry, we can also confuse words along the way, which can be fun.
There is something about the thinking about rules, thinking about misreading, misseeing, and so the rules are there, but then all these kind of mishaps happen against them, which I think are absolutely fascinating. And moments for such great creativity. When you misread a word, it can feel frustrating, but then also it gives such another dimension of possibility to the meaning that was, the literal meaning that's on the surface. And same with misseeing something from a spatial point of view, either enhancing the tactility of it or seeing it as it, perhaps shouldn't be seen. The creative possibility in that, I think, is if one can tap into it, is limitless.
With the misreading of road signs, I find endlessly fascinating, and they really make me laugh because now I know it well enough that I read it and I think that can't be that. But I very clearly remember being in Melbourne with my Japanese colleague Asuka, and saying, only in Melbourne would the hairdressers be called vagina. And she said, yes, say, but that hairdressers are called Virginia, for example. And these go on endlessly.
We have 2 questions. Shall we pass over to those? Michelle, I think your hand was up first.
Oh, yeah, it was less of a question. It was more, I don't know. I just wanted to add also just somehow with my architecture, my designs, I've found that it's easier for me to use dance, or it's just one of the ways that I've worked. And I thought also because it's so honest, the medium of dance, and because I think people's bodies are like an innate language that we are intuitive with, and it's a way I can get out of my brain. So I found that in the end I've used dance and also other senses like sound. Who also know, I've got a friend Daedalus, he's a professor at Berkeley. He's also very dyslexic, and then like kind of chaotic or meditative things that I end up with. So it always ends up getting pushed towards like that other space, other senses to get to the intuitive place. Yeah. So.
I think there's a huge interrelationship between dance and architecture, and you look at going right back to Nurse Cunningham, but it becomes about kind of architectural movement. So I'm going, you go back to the Highland dances, which are so formal that they almost start building buildings within the those dances, all the kind of fluidity of how we can, the human and the space. And if architecture is anything, it's about a dialogue when it's good, between the human and the space that is being built around the human. I mean, that kind of notion of fluid movement. We're looking at whether it's Michael Clark, we really feel that. We've been working with a performance artist called Eleanor. I've just forgotten her surname, but we bring her to projects halfway through, and she'll do a performance that describes Maggie's when it was a building site. So she goes in and kind of corrupts the vision of the space. We did another project in Thailand with her where she built 5,000 round earth bricks. And then the performance was one building the bricks with the locals, but then laying out this kind of magical, almost like the yellow brick road throughout this festival. And then she just slowly walks across the festival. And this movement becomes very dance and very descriptive of space. I suppose it's about describing lines.
Yeah. I was just wondering how people reacted to that. Like, how did they feel? And if they were like prompted to behave differently.
People, I think in the festival, it's just another kind of crazy thing going on. I think within the Maggies, it got a lot of very credible responses because it really transforms how the site was working, but also it starts to bring the builders much more into the dialogue. And I think one of the negative things of the way we construct now, particularly on a large scale, is this corporate nature of the architect. You lose the personal relationship between the builder and the building that you had from the old craftsman. And I think this kind of intervention can really produce a greater relationship. And for me, that relationship is the most important thing. I can't bear it when we go and employ a builder and we talk to a man in a suit, then a man turns up not in a suit to do the building, but they don't know each other and there's no interrelationship. And then for sure, the conversation I've had with the suit, sorry, I shouldn't say man, a person, is completely different from the conversation I had with the guy on the site. I want to talk to the guy on the site. The suit generally knows nothing, and I think it's a great shame that we've lost that interrelationship.
Yeah. Also like that Carpenting kind of the Carpenting relationship where people try things together and like kind of create and make. I don't know, I just like some of the complex curves that we had in one of the buildings. It was super complex because it was just a path, so it could really move around, but people obviously still have to stand on it. But that was really interesting because I had this guy just wanted to try stuff and had no idea what he's doing, and he kind of worked it out. But I think those people sometimes, I just find like there's secrets from everybody, like then everyone's intelligence becomes part of it, you know.
I'm always saying to my team the importance of being respectful and listening to the makers, because our clients change all the time, but we always go back to the good makers, and that interrelationship is so important because without them we cannot do something which is unusual. We get stuck in the same rules. We're going back to the rule word and the same processes, and if we want to corrupt and transform those processes, as us neurodiverse do so well, we need to borrow hands from someone else to do it. So I think those relationships are super important.
Cool.
To build transformation and change.
But that also brings back the tactile. If there's a constant dialogue with who's making something and not just designing it, that the tactility is always returned to the project. And that tactility, which is so important, is present at all times and not just working as a function, but actually part of the whole making process. So it returns design to its making roots, in a sense, I suppose.
And maybe this is one of the fears of the computer, because there's very little tactility in a keyboard and a mouse, whereas a sketchbook and a soft pencil, or a piece of card and a model, this has much more dexterity to it. I always argued with my dad about the beauty of the soft pencil. He never understood it. He liked really hard pencils that would make very defined lines. And maybe this is to do with if I was wanting to be, there's the arrogance of architecture and the male architect and the belief in their single line. Whereas I guess my background is a little bit more on the art side, and I love the ambiguity of the soft line and that it takes you to places that you don't necessarily expect to go to. Maybe being more curious and questioning, less assertive and confident. So these are the many characters formed from the disciplines and the process.
I thought of this like an amazing example, super interesting, was Rudolf Steiner. They did the Goetheanum, which is like the big headquarters or whatever of Steiner stuff. And so he had to have 5 pictures displaying different times or whatever they were. I think just different times, and he and different incarnations of things. Anyway, but he just did a sketch, and there was nothing specific. And then from there, the artists had to take it over and craft it and make it their own. It was really this rough thing in this thick pastel, and it was sort of just about how like giving people the impulse of things, not giving it all to them, which sort of ties into other talk of like how people place their own creativity inside of it, and that's much more liberating than the designer just kind of handing it all over.
The process becomes part of the journey. There was a really brilliant exhibition. I'm just looking for the catalogue because it's in this part of my little library, but I can't see it. But it was really looking at the influence of the kindergarten on modern art and looking at how everyone from Duchamp to Leger had been all brought up in Steiner, in kindergarten, and they're beginning to use these very geometrical shapes and colours and numbers, and they start to show the interrelationship of these movements. We're talking about De Stijl, we're talking about all the modernism at the beginning of the 20th century, and this incredible influence coming from the kindergartens, and as a way of teaching. Let's see if I can find that. I'll put it on the chat afterwards when I find it.
Thanks.
As these influences, but yes, totally. I think.
Super. Thank you, Michelle. Danny, I think you've got your hand up. Hello. Maybe tell us where you're calling from as well. Would be really interesting.
Hi, calling from the middle of the countryside in the Cotswolds in England. So hi. So this is fascinating. I've got two things to ask. Well, one main thing I want to ask, but before I do that, I just wanted to make an observation and wonder if a lot of what we're talking about with dance and space, it's only something I've become aware of recently. Is there like we talk about the five senses, but is there a sixth? There's like more senses, but there's a sixth sense, which is it the proprioceptive sense, which is probably the dyspraxic thing about how we relate to the space that we're in, and it's our understanding of why we might be clumsy, but how we connect with the space. And I just wonder if that's anything to do with the feeling of dancing and moving in a space. I'm not a dancer at all, but I wonder if it's that element, that sense, that extra sense that is being tapped into.
I think that connection, I've never thought about that as being a sixth sense. I think that's really interesting as a perspective. When I talk with Pete Aldorf, he always talks about time being the sixth sense, because in a garden, it's the next access to how time transforms it. But to go back to the a space which is really exquisite totally affects the way that you feel and you behave. No. I suppose in the studio, we're talking a lot about the notion of the space as the third carer, looking at how the space can support you from a psychological and therefore a health perspective, and how it can make you feel. And as a joyous space, you want to just kind of curl up and do somersaults in it, or you want to behave in a very different way. And that dialogue becomes very embracing and opening up. But I'm going to think more about this notion of the relationship between the space and the person as a sixth sense. So I think that's super interesting. But maybe Dispel wants to come on that. Have you gone? Come back to us. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's not behind his screen.
Hey, sorry, I was setting up YouTube Kids for my daughter. Sorry, I wasn't actually listening. So,
just think about performance in space. I just think it kind of enters very much into your area, maybe more than mine even. And so I just thought, as we had the advantage of you being there.
Mm-hmm, sure. I don't know if this is related at all, but something that I was reading about the disability aesthetic yesterday. Actually, no, it's not really related. It's more about sort of the idea of straight lines in modernism, and especially in architectural design and so on, and that mirroring how society sees and so on. And it's not really related, but anyway, it's basically about neurodivergent thinking and how potentially that the aesthetic of modernist design and basically straight lines, clean lines, mirrors a kind of utopian idea of society. And if neurodivergent thinking is something that is different from the subjective idea of normal, then are you diverting? And neurodivergent thinking is something perceived as not perfect, not pristine, not the ideal human, the kind of Aryan, kind of slightly monstrous idea of perfection. And I guess, I wonder how that works. But So what you're talking about specifically, sorry, is basically about space and how space works.
Why don't you give your very articulate question again?
Sorry.
Okay. So I don't want to forget the other question I've got to ask, but it was more of an observation. It was connecting the two things you were talking about, and also with dance and using the space. And I was just curious about how we have 5 senses, and I've recently been learning about the other senses that we have, and one of them, the 6th sense, I think is relating to I can't pronounce it, I think it's the proprioceptive sense, which is how our body makes sense of the space around us, and how so I suppose maybe human scale, or how we interpret the space around us. It's like an occupational therapy term, I think, proprioceptive. I might be mispronouncing it, I don't know, but it's called the 6th sense, and it is apparently a scientific thing, and it's not this mystical thing. I just wondered if that was the thing, that the essence of what this feeling is.
Yeah, proprioceptive sense.
That's it.
Right, yeah. I mean, totally.
I don't know this word either. I need to learn it.
It's kind of, I think it's kind of relating to an idea of, okay, so when you're sitting in a room right now, I'm sitting in the wrong space for me. My desk, obviously, I'm not using our office anymore. We haven't really used it for a year, purely because of COVID. But my perfect place is sitting at the back of a room, facing the space, having everything in front of me. Maybe it's some kind of proper Neanderthalic idea of sort of, I need to make sure I can see my enemy coming towards me, or whatever. I need to sort of have this big space in front of me, rather than behind me. And I guess in terms of, it would be interesting to hear if anybody's got anything to say about how they work, and what's the perfect conditions to what's their perfect methodology of creation of ideas, of creation of their work, how they work and where they work, and how that space around them that they've created for themselves to work in is essential for them to the free flow of ideas.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can I connect everything that we've just talked about there to my bigger question that I really wanted to raise and share with everybody? Is that okay? Can I keep? Okay. So I have this fascination with public commercial spaces and how they make us feel. And the number one I feel that has a huge responsibility, and it's completely neglectful, is supermarkets. And how we it's a very clinical, straight line, the utopia thing that you talked about, like the sort of perfect, efficient space for probably neurotypicals. However, I feel that they are quite intense spaces. So there's a thing called the quiet hour that some supermarkets are creating, which is 1 hour a week where they dim the lights, turn down the beeps of the till, and stop the tannoy announcements. But my thinking is that would be a better environment for everybody. So in trying to be inclusive, they're adding this 1 hour maximum a week, which kind of makes me think they're excluding the sort of neurodivergent people 99% of the time with these really stimulating, intense environments. So I kind of wanted to raise the question, one, should we be changing the environment so that it's always like that? And what else can happen to supermarkets to make them feel inclusive and connective and enjoyable spaces, rather than like a chore that's got to be ticked off and everybody hates going because it's a time waster, and which is selfish, which is bizarre, because it's such a food should be such an indulgent and treasured thing, but it's just not a very nice experience shopping for the food.
Completely. I think supermarket, they're cruel places. I mean, they really subject us to, they try to oversell us. They try to manipulate us to consume things in very different ways. And I think the first thing is, I'm not sure if I really believe in perfect efficiency, because I think it depends what it is that you're trying to do. So I think the whole, the Bauhaus obsession with form follows function. Well, what is the function? If the function is to get the chair off the ground, great. But if the function is to make you feel secure, then it's a very different function. If the function is to sell you lots of food, which you don't necessarily need, and therefore to create more greed and more consumption, then the supermarket is very successful. But if the function is to educate you and to calm you and to put you at peace, then it's a really horrendous place. From everything, from the way it's lit, to the pumping of the smelling of bread, even when they're not baking the bread in it, to playing all these kind of quite grotesque psychological tools, which what the shopping mall has also tried to do for years and years and years. I don't know if it's fair to tie it down to purely the neurodivergent and the neuronormal. And I don't know if I really believe in the neuronormal, but I think everyone probably prefers it when it's a bit darker and a bit calmer and a bit softer. But I'm sure they sell less stuff at that moment because you're in a much more contemplative zone. You're not feeling the adrenaline to buy, or the push on consumption. But I think the psychology, I think the hospital for me is the worst offender of this. And you go into a hospital, you have awful fluorescent lights, which are very, very green. And then they'll have a few in a different temperature because the states run out of those tubes and they put a couple more in. Then you have all these bits of equipment, which are for keeping people alive. And sometimes they don't work. And so they're always reminding you of the horror you're in. You have no idea about daytime and nighttime. You have this continual acoustic pollution of beep and beep and beep. And so you have real sensory deprivation. And it's what we can do to try and reverse this psychology, because architecture, hospitals need to make you better. But if the architecture if the building is sick, it can never make you, it's very hard to make you better. So you recover from your broken leg, but you get severe depression instead. In a way, I prefer to have a broken leg. So I don't know what we can, I do know what we can do, and it's a huge project, but reversing all this engineering is so complicated. And to really get under the skin of it, we need to, we need to really change the rules that we were talking about at the beginning. And we need to change the kind of the notion of efficiency. Because for me, efficiency is it's not about the direct line. It's often more efficient to go on a longer line if you achieve more from it. We were working on a house in Bali years ago, and the client said, I've never actually really checked this whether it's true or not, but in the Hindu principles, ghosts hide in the corners. So she wanted to eliminate all the corners of the house. And this is a method it's inefficient from a construction point of view, often to have no corner. But the human has no corners. And so if you have a curve and a curve, they're much more comfortable together. So whether it's just rubbing off the corners of a cabinet or whether it's radiusing the corners of the walls, this idea of creating these surfaces that flow continuous and are seamless rather than these abrupt, clunky butt joints, I find it so much more successful. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I can't answer it. The question is a very open, endless question.
It's really interesting hearing. It's interesting hearing, I suppose, the obstacles of commercialism in supermarkets and how they compete on trying to secure more and more spend. And I just wonder if sometimes creating a more human-friendly environment would put them at a competitive advantage and therefore become more successful based on being a nicer space. And I just can't imagine them ever thinking that way, but I kind of feel it's quite logical to me that by creating a space that you want to be, they'll win. You might drive, say, 2 miles in the other direction to go somewhere that's more enjoyable. So as a tactic of, as a commercial objective, I wonder if there is anything in a supermarket actually trying to put the human at the front of their design, of their experience.
Yes, I think the real problem is that these places are very, very conservative. It's like our industry, the building industry, they really hate change. If the building industry was more progressive, we would have prefabrication everywhere because it is, more efficient and higher quality. We would have, we could change, we can make things so much more sustainable, but nobody wants to change the way they work. The supermarket has created the system based on the American system for years and years and years. And to suddenly to become much more human focused would be really difficult. For me, the best thing is to try to avoid the supermarket.
Yeah.
to go to the local grocer.
True.
Where the man, like the carpenter on the building site, knows where the vegetables have come from, and he turns them, or she turns them, they caress them, they make sure they move them around, and you have a much nicer pair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. It makes it. Oh, sorry, just look. I don't know your name.
Oh, it's Kaz.
Cass, hello. Sorry, I'm not. Hello, Cass. What were you going to say?
In education, there's a classic phrase which is what's good for a dyslexic is usually good for everyone. So making education more accessible, quieter rooms, so one-to-one teaching and yada yada, making things easier to understand, basically. So I guess that rule would probably work for most people. It's just you've got to think that neurodiversity slightly differs from neurodivergence, in that neurodiversity is all human minds, all different ways of thinking. You might have someone on the autistic spectrum that might have a trait of high sensitivity, which is obviously useful in a huge amount of, especially in design, high sensitivity and in realizing the nuance and the details and everything like that. But some people don't have that, and some people do. They love the hubbub. People working in a cafe, for instance, they work there in a very noisy cafe because they've got that surround, that kind of cushion of noise, which they know is there, and it enables them to focus. So I wonder if basically just different brains need different environments. I'm sure there is obviously a humanist norm that everybody likes. Yeah. But we know, Kaz, that there's no such thing as a humanist norm. The norm is always changing. But certainly, I've designed, we design restaurants where the client have wanted a really noisy space, and they want that bouncing, frustrating, and then and to the contrary. I guess so. I mean, we all like central heating. I mean, there are aspects of humanity which we are all the same. We all think in the same way, I guess.
We do all like central heating. It comes very stuffy. I like a bit of ventilation, a bit of air blowing. Yeah, we don't like being freezing cold, but that's different from liking central heating, possibly. But maybe I'm being too simplistic with my hatred of the norm. I think the idea of the neuro-norm always winds me up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. Michelle?
Look what it gets us. Sorry, Ellen.
I think Ellen wanted to say something.
Oh,
she just put up her hand.
Ellen, yes.
Yeah, first.
Yes, Ellen, I'm sorry. You did have your hand up. I'm sorry. I apologise.
That's all right. And I guess thinking kind of, because obviously everyone's brain is different, and neurodivergence is such a wide spectrum, and also that you can argue that there isn't really such a thing as neurotypical. But I guess the way we can create an inclusive society is making sure that everyone has their own space that they are comfortable in, and making sure that, that's the difference between quality and equity, isn't it? Equality is everyone having the same thing, and equity is everyone having what they need. And I think that's kind of what's often glossed over. For instance, in education, whilst simplifying the educational system would work for a lot of people, there are other people that it wouldn't work for at all. For me, despite the fact I'm neurodivergent, I flew through school because everything was just my brain works at 150 miles an hour, so everything was just too slow for me. Everything was slow and boring and not stimulating enough. And you mentioned, Abe, earlier how you like to think, you want to know how other people work and what their workspaces are like. Mine is someone else will walk in and think it's an absolute bomb site in here, but for me it's just how I like it, because there's just stuff everywhere, constant inspiration everywhere I look. There's colours, there's shapes, it's constantly interesting for me. I guess that's kind of what we need to aim for, is a society and community, is everyone needing their own space and also having a space where everyone is welcome all at the same time, so they have your place to retreat back to as well. I guess that's what's important.
There's a funny background. Someone's
Can everybody mute themselves who's not talking, please?
That's much easier. I think it's it's fascinating to hear. I couldn't quite work out what you were saying about your school, that you flew through it, but it just bored you along the way.
Yeah, it was just like, particularly like primary and secondary school. I did well in everything because I don't know. I guess just my brain works the way that the education system is tailored to, but which is not right in any way. I'm not going to start on talking about the problems with the education system until tomorrow. But
I think I think that's it's super interesting. But I think what's really important is that people are allowed to work in the way they want to work, and this idea that there is a kind of wallpaper aesthetic. I don't know if you've ever seen the book of Ty Brulett on offices, which I find so repellent, where he wants to control everything. And people are only allowed to wear beige clothes. And I think there was always a story about Norman Foster that every angle point had to be at the same angle. And then what's the point of having a flexible light if you can't flex it? For me, it's really important that people need to be able to work and they want to work. It comes complicated if you have a desk of a very, very chaotic, messy desk and next to a very neat and tidy desk, because they influence each other. But we've got to give people the space to create their own creativity. And we can't dictate it. Not in an education and not in an office. If we want to get the most out of our studio, if we want to get the most out of our working relationship, we need to give authorship to the artist.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of, again, like talking about rules and intuition. It's like we're kind of governed by all these rules and like how you should work, particularly during like college years, like A-level years. I did A-level fine art, and it was so restrictive in how you were allowed to work.
And the perception of I failed O-level pottery twice. Can I say?
Yeah, I mean, I flunked my A-level art because that's just not. I couldn't follow the rules, like the way you have to like show you're working and you have to kind of like produce all of these like progress drawings. But because my brain is so like by the time I've come to my end point, like I haven't had enough time to like get it all down on paper because I make connections so quickly that it's like, I don't know, following the rules it's not possible sometimes. Not that I don't want to or that I'm not clear on what the rules are, it's just sometimes it's not possible to follow the rules. I guess that's another issue, that kind of another way that rules restrict people.
And I don't really have a desk at this point in my life. I'm very mobile and nomadic. I have a sketchbook and a bag, and I move around the office or the house finding. I have little corners that I prefer. I like with cats. I like to look out. Now
that's really interesting because we so I'm still at uni. Last semester in the second year, and we did a project. Have you heard of the brand C-Matic? They make kitchens. Like really bespoke, like fancy kitchens. We kind of did a live project for them where they were asked us to integrate the kind of the office space into the kitchen. And my idea was to create, rather than have just like an office next to a kitchen, it was like creating spaces all throughout the house where you could just like plonk your sketchbook or your laptop down and like, just get to work.
I spent my life in the kitchen. I have a large island.
Yeah.
When my kids were doing their A-levels, they would sit on the other side. I work on the same island. I just moved down here to do this talk. I was working the island for my first 5 calls of the morning. I'm so bored of Zooms. I think it'd be so much nicer to be in a classroom. And we're talking about all these sensory, spatial things. And here I'm facing a wall. But at least I'm facing a wall. When I look at myself, I see my space behind me. So one could do it the other way around. I don't know. But it's complicated. How we create triggers in a virtual platform, I guess, is the big question. Or we just try and move back to a physical space. So it has been interesting, I suppose. We do a lot of our work is international, and I suppose with Zoom, it's been the first time when it has not felt like a disadvantage not to be in the same country as the project. So there is some equalizing, I guess, for Zoom. Whether you're working in Australia, okay, you have the time difference, but there's no advantage to being on site or not if you can't go to site. Well, that's the only advantage I've come across.
I'll let someone else ask a question.
Thank you, Ellen. Michelle, back to you.
Cool. Just want to see if we can get this little hand thing. Yeah, I've got like a kind of more technicalish question. Because I was just thinking, well, two things. So they're but interlinked. Yeah, maybe three things. That it was sort of, if everybody wants different things and it's neurodiverse, like just with the movement, because I was looking at things that are just more adaptive and responsive, even if they are modular. Like if there was a big red room or a desk, could you spin something around? Could it be swiveled and then it's a blue-green? So you could have a blue-green day or a red day or whatever. But just that if you've got examples where you've managed to use adaptability in that way. And then the other thing is that I was really curious, or kind of working quite a bit with the sound thing. And so I didn't know, like from your website until the lecture, like about the, like all of those drawers that came in and out and how people were curious about them. And like you had a lot on sound, but a lot of it was exhibition. And when I was trying to design for sound, I had two problems, because the one was, I was going to do it with Alfred, the other dyslexic guy, but the one was, it's cool we were going to do 3 sensors that all motion that people use and using the electrics, but I also wanted low tech stuff. And then I found that really difficult, because then it meant like expensive materials, like like wood pongs, like in Africa we have the xylophone, like stairs, a xylophone, or just different pieces that you'd have to actually tune. Like low tech stuff seems like it's something you have to go back, you have to tune it, and it actually needs like this constant maintenance, which is also really lovely. But also just that if it went wider than a kind of very contained, small, sort of 1 to 3 audience or office or something, I felt like it came into troubles with like keeping it in a way that people, not everyone's going to like it, but in a way that it's sort of all right. Like if it was a sound canceller, what would it do? And it eased it. Seems like everyone could handle that. But just yours were quite particular and fun and provocative. So yeah, I was just wondering, like if there was any spaces where people like being with the sound, like for extended periods of time, and whether you had any low tech, high tech examples. And then
in a town in Hicon, which is a coastal town in Spain, up from Cantabria, the next. There's an amazing Chillida. Do you know the sculptor Chillida?
No.
Very important Spanish sculptor. He trained originally as an architect.
Okay, cool.
He has a big foundation, and he creates this on top of the cliff. He creates this arch structure, and it grabs hold of the sound of the sea. So if you stand in the middle of this arch, you can hear the sea perfectly. If you stand here, it's gone. You stand here, it's gone. So it becomes this system of, like a cave, like when we listen to a stone, of amplifying, of grabbing from what's there and playing it back to you. This is very, very low tech. It's incredibly skillful in how he's managed to capture this sound. You go to the whispering chambers in Westminster, in St. Paul, in St. Paul's, and you get these incredible sound corridors and vessels. A bell is a very low tech sonic trigger to an extent. But there's a very interesting DJ called Nick Luscombe, and he has a website called Musicity, I think. Now, don't ask me how to spell it. Which really, what he does is he commissions people. He goes in and he measures all the sound waves of a space, and then he commissions people to create music designed around those sound waves. So more recently, we did a project with him recently, which was about unbuilt projects. And so then we worked with a really super edgy London queer artist who created this crazy piece of music to this space that didn't yet exist. So it's quite conceptual. But he also does it to lots of traditional spaces around it. And he goes around recording sounds and then playing them back. There's also a very interesting program on Radio 4, which is about architecture for the blind. And it's about an architect who went blind, and then he becomes really, really conscious of how a building sounds because he can't see it. And if you have a very soft floor, you don't know where people are coming from. So how can you make sound more architectural, more directional along the way? You know, in exactly the same way that we texture surfaces for the blind, how can we texture the audio tapestry for the as to amplify the senses? And I find all this kind of sensory amplification. And it's the whole thing of going outside when it's been snowing and everything gets so softened. Or when you go into a lift and they have that protective quilting on, and you're standing in this really soft environment. Or then you go into a huge space where everything just echoes endlessly. So I think there's a huge amount to play there. But I don't agree that the low-tech solutions need to be very expensive and extravagant. Everything has a noise, and it's trying to get the noise to come out of it.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in Thailand, everything was chimes, like chimes everywhere.
Or expensive.
Just to keep it happy. Was there any things that you run into trouble with, like just from your exhibitions and things that warn us? Or happy moments, one happy moment, or one perceived happy moment, one perceived troublesome moment.
With sounds, or with, and I think
with sounds, because you had that room, I think, and then you had those boxes which were
the room sound were just the sounds of all the clunky engineering moving, which was great.
Yeah.
We hadn't really considered that at all before it. You know, we enjoyed a lot. Well, I think the classic sound mistake we made was in Kuwait, which of course is in the middle of the desert. So we did everything around cracking ice and polar conditions and these winds blowing across. And we made this really sculptural, very emotional soundtrack as you went down the corridors of this super high-end department store. But the result was everyone just spent their time in the toilet and not buying food. I mean, not buying fashion, which is what they're supposed to be doing. So they turned that off after a month. So that was, we did in Leeds for the Corn Exchange, we did a greeting situation that said hello to you in 100 languages. And that drove all the shopkeepers totally mad. So it sounds very dangerous. It needs to reinvent itself. It can't repeat because people get really bored of it if they keep hearing the same sounds. But now you can do so much more sophisticated things with computers. Those big machines, and they can just build up a vocabulary of sounds and they can pull from them, or with nature. So I think, we have all these hinges that have no sounds to them. I always love the idea of attaching a squeaky hinge to a Blum hinge. So you have the memories of the past in a way. When things are too silent, what can we do to add to it? There was always a story in the VAT office, which is like 3 stories underground, so they can't be attacked. I don't know why it's so far underground, but they engineered it so it was absolutely silent. And then nobody dared to use the telephone because as soon as someone spoke, everybody heard it. So then they had to pipe in this kind of this grey noise or white noise, I think white noise they call it, to make people feel more at home.
Yeah, I just also wondered, like, just everyday things, like, in that Billy Elliot, like, where you just run your finger around the wall, like a fence, glunk, 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 or like just, coming downstairs, just like things that give people joy. We don't realize how much motion we're doing, or down underground, When
we hear the birds out the window, that gives us joy. And I think it's that, when we hear the sea lapping, or there's a very specific noise of all the halyards in a shipyard tackling the metal, and they conjure up different emotions.
Mm. Cool.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks.
There's something about being a student, not that your projects are only limited when you're a student, Abe, but about this is the place of making mistakes and experimentation when one is a student.
I made mistakes as a professional as well.
That's what I'm saying. You didn't just keep your mistakes to when you were a student, but there is something to harness the liberating space of being a student and making mistakes. and experiments with all of these kind of things.
The problem is they get much
essential.
We cast the rubber floor in Selfridges at 6 a.m, and we were doing something no contractor would do it. So we said, oh, fuck it, we'll do it ourselves. And you had to put all these masses of polyurethane in a giant bucket. You had to mix it. Anyway, we didn't mix it enough. We poured it and it never went off. And so anyone entering Selfridges, which is quite pristine, they would have these green footprints that would then appear elsewhere. Now, Selfridges were not pleased with us at the end of that. They have forgiven me, and I am there working again, or was, when there was retail work around. And I think there was another retail project where we tried to create this moving lines all around the space. So we made this whole thing a bungee, we bolted everything to the walls, but we had completely underestimated the amount of collective pressure from all the bungee. And at a certain point when the moving started, the whole thing imploded, and just luckily no one was hurt. And then I think that was a really big one. And we became much more health and safety respectful after that moment. I think it was, we have never hurt anyone, and that has been. So I suppose that is the risk of mistakes, making mistakes not hurt people.
We have one more hand up. Miguel, over to you.
Oh, hi, thank you. It's been really inspiring since last week too. So, but as you were talking about sounds, it just reminded me of a project I did last year, because we were all stuck at home. And right across my place here, there's a building site going on. And I've been recording like all the different sounds that they were making while constructing the building. And in Portuguese, there's a very interesting play of words with the act of building. So a work of art, for instance, it's called obra, which is the same word used as a construction site, right? So the work itself played around with this notion. So I recorded the sounds, and then I made like about 14 different QR codes for each sound that were playing with the idea of obra as a work of art and obra as a construction site. And then the idea was a very like low-tech solution. I would just print it on a A3 and put it up on the wall. And I was imagining it like in an exhibition space. So I was thinking about people looking at that and then trying to figure out what it was. And then at the time they were putting their phones in front of it, the sounds would come out of the phone. So I could imagine like 5 people pointing their phones to the thing and then creating all that mess inside the gallery space. So I can share it after I speak here on the chat, so you can make a better idea of what it is. But I was also thinking about this idea of how pristine and quiet these exhibition spaces are usually like. And also, how do you bring noise, and a noise that it's not actually pleasant, right? So these are sounds that are part of a construction site, but they are forgotten once the building is there, right? So I wanted
the scars of the past.
Yeah, and also how annoying it can be, right? When you are stuck in a place and you have to listen to those noises, right? So you have to work, but then the noise is in the background. Maybe I'm not sure how good this microphone is, so you might be listening to something going on right now. So you can imagine like a quarantine, like a lockdown, with this kind of soundtrack. Right?
So the idea of disturbance is really well documented, and is really interesting. And how by disturbing us, we get us thinking in a different way, and by surprising it. And I think there was a big exhibition about mines in the north of England, Magna, I think it was called. And every hour, at a certain 20 past every hour, there would be a huge kind of explosion, which was about the mine starting up again. And everyone would look around and this thing would cycle. But just that moment's noise would really engage the senses and kind of get you. I think also in the Science Museum, London, there's a very eccentric artist from Southwold called Tim Hutkins, who has created a series of very small interventions, one of which is a series of hot water bottles, which every, 23 minutes, they suddenly go off and they all start moving up and down, hitting the ceiling. and these hot water bottles become like fishes, and they make a really crazy noise. And everyone suddenly looks up and goes, why are a load of hot water bottles moving up in the ceiling? So again, it's educational because it's changing the way we're thinking. It's inspiring our responses and our thoughts. So I think it sounds really interesting. And the idea, the nice thing about the barcode is it's so direct, it's so instantaneous, straight back into the system.
Yeah. But at the same time, if you think about how much these sounds can affect us once they are continuous, right? So all this mechanic noise, when they are like a sound here and there or in a controlled space, they can be okay and also like inspiring. But what happens when they are like nonstop?
Yeah, they can drive you mad. Look at all of they use sound like this all the time in all those awful tortures. I don't know if you've seen. It's too sad to talk about. But completely. I think it can be totally.
Because normally we associate sounds with something pleasant, right? So and then once they're finished, we kind of get good memories, or we just forget about them. So when they are like not that pleasant, I'm always wondering, like, how do we handle them, right?
Yeah, well, we put headphones on or we go a little bit crazy. But I think also, as Kes was talking about before, this whole notion of being super sensitive, which often comes with neurodiversity, that they can really drive us to the point of craziness.
Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
always banning my kids from their Snapchat. I can't bear all that digital, It drives me mental.
Well, thank you.
Are there any other hands that I can
There's a hand
see?
here, but I can't see a name to it.
Is there? I can't see any hands. Can you see one?
I can see a hand. You with a hand up. What's your name?
Sasha.
Sasha. Hi, Sasha. Hi. I think for some reason your name was being hidden by I don't know, something.
I wasn't sure if it was me that you were talking to. So I was just thinking about what you were saying, that everything has a sound. And a while ago, I went to the London Surf Film Festival, and there was a live performance. This artist called CJ Mirror was performing the soundtrack live to a surf film. So it was almost like an orchestra on stage. And he, at one point, played a clothes horse, like a drying rack, the sort of metal.
I've seen people play a wooden clothes horse, yeah?
It was metal.
Even better.
And had a bow, and he sort of played it as if it was a violin. And that, for some reason, the sound that made kind of stirred the same feeling in your tummy of when you're taking the drop on a wave. Like it's that kind of moment where you feel a bit like you're in midair, there's no gravity, and you sort of have this pit before you drop, and then you go down. And I was just thinking about the sort of feelings that sound can provoke and how it can transport you back to a place. And wondering if you've got any thoughts on silences, so how there can be a comfortable, peaceful silence in a space, and then you go into another space and the silence in that place might feel eerie and uncomfortable, and how that kind of, how is that created, and how is it possible that you can have such a difference of feeling from a silence, and like how does that translate to space, etc.?
Well, is it not? Well, there's different. I mean, there's more. It's not so dissimilar from white, isn't it? You can go into one white room and it makes you feel one thing, and you go into another white room and you feel something very different. So everything becomes about the nuance, I guess, to a degree. But if you go into an anabolic chamber, they're called anabolic chambers, where you have no sound, scientific no sound, and you can hear your blood move. You hear your heart, and it's incredibly uncomfortable. It's the opposite of comfortable because it's become so silent that you become as conscious of the silence as you are of the noise. Does that make sense? So the silence, I think what you're describing is the absence of noise rather than the absence of life. So for me, sound becomes broken up into hard and soft, like light does, like color does in a way. So you want soft silence, which means you need to be in a space with quite soft materials around, with wood, with things where sounds can get trapped and caught, and not reflective. Because in a very hard space, there can be no one making a noise, but the atmosphere, the silence is very hard, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think like coming from a wellness perspective as well, that's so interesting you saying about a soft silence, because when you're going into like meditation, you want to feel so, like your space is holding you in that silence and in that
You might feel control and ownership of that space as much as anything, and it becomes about I think yoga is such an interesting meditation kind of architectural metaphor, because it all becomes about the notion of compression and tension, which are the two key things to all structures. And I think we can take that same dialogue to sound, and it's this compression and tension, and the two moving elements of that sound. And then what we need from the softness is the power of absorbing, which is, again, very meditational, no? It's about absorbing your energy, about absorbing the building, absorbing your sounds, and then building up a kind of soft tension between the two.
Yeah, it's like it absorbs your thoughts as well. It doesn't reflect them all back at you.
No, it removes the noise, because things stop bouncing. I love mirrors, but sometimes one wants you just to be held in silence, and mirrors are quite noisy because they reflect it, as are hard surfaces. And glossy surfaces even more. I mean, sound works very like light. So glossy surfaces will reflect sound much more than a matte surface.
Awesome. Thank you.
Pleasure. I'm afraid I have a dog might be turning up, so it could get noisy, talking of sound.
Sylvia, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, hi. Hi, I am. I don't quite know how I fell in here, but I'm finding fascinating. I am a dancer. I'm not a designer. And you mentioned neuronormal. I don't know. I don't have any categories to put myself into. But I'm just really fascinated by the ideas of sound. And I normally work in an improvisational ensemble of dancers. And through the first lockdown, we decided to try to work on Zoom and see how that would work. So normally we are in the space and we improvise within each other's influences. And we've known each other for quite a long time. So there's a lot of intimacy in terms of knowing where people are in space, even if you're not looking at them. So there's quite a lot of that kind of intimacy and knowledge of each other and perception and all those other factors that people mentioned before. But then we became really frustrated in trying to create movement together just by looking at, the Zoom square. And we decided to just turn the camera off and imagine that we were with each other and try to connect like that. So it was fascinating because obviously we all bring this kind of internal image of each other and have memories of experiences. And now we diluted all that and we're working just in ways of sonifying presence and trying to create movement just by having each other as a soundscape and how those soundscapes will interact and create new movement and new sounds. So trying to move away from the visual. So I'm not sure what I wanted to get in bringing this in, but I think my curiosity is about being architecture being experienced from all senses, but the visual sense being quite a strong one, maybe a dominant one, or maybe an entry one.
For me, it's an entry one. They're all there, but you need to find. But I think what you're talking about also is what we talked about at the beginning, which is this notion of getting into the zone and getting lost into the zone. And there's that great, I think, was it Nurse Cunning that the dancers never knew what the music was before that they danced in it. So they were dancing in these kind of strange silences. And when the music's played, they have to distract themselves away from the music because they need to be concentrating on the dance. And yet the craziness that these two layers come together so well. So the dancers look like they're performing to the music, but they didn't know what the music was going to be, so they can't be. I don't know. Which comes back to the notion of the instinct. Yeah. But in those moments, what I feel people are doing is they're describing space. Dance starts to describe space, becomes almost about the anti-space that is around them. And in that way, it becomes very architectural. to a degree. And I think great architecture becomes very, very fluid and comes like a dance when done well. And more, I think architecture becomes less about the formal and less about the concrete and the constructed, and can become about the ephemeral. What the word am I trying to say?
Ephemeral.
Ephemeral. As it moves across. And so that's when these disciplines really start to there's an awful lot of very solid non-ephemeral architecture going up in Hackney right now as I speak, which is very dull and box-like with lots of bricks. But I think for me that is not the future.
Yeah, something about creating dance without seeing the bodies. It's like creating dance from the kind of sound that produces. So installation, having an
in a way.
Yeah, so how we get to kind of cut down the visual input, at least for dance, that's my kind of investigation at the moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm in Bristol, by the way, and I am from Brazil, so there's quite a few Brazilians in this as well, which was nice.
But they're not all in Bristol. I like Bristol and Brazil. Having all these Bs together is very appropriate.
Thank you.
I could add, if you look to eurythmy, which is also Steiner form, then we deal with we do a lot of that relating non-visually and being aware of the backspace, what's behind you. And you're supposed to actually, if someone walks behind you, you're supposed to be able to feel them, almost anticipate. So if I know they're at 9 o'clock behind me or wherever it is, then I move. So the whole dance is like based on being able to sensually percept each other. And then also he has a lot of dances that are related to geometries found in nature, and then planetary gestures, which impact us. So yeah, it's could be a rich space to explore other things. Yeah, but he also, and then also on the senses, Steiner like says 13 senses. So that's also like balance, imagination, perception. So these, I think all these things that we're talking about are just like they stimulate those extrasensory perceptions, which create part of our humanity and more possibility.
Are you a Steiner? You work with Steiner now?
Yeah, I never started that way. I just loved organic architecture. And at the time, there were no organic or eco architects. They didn't exist. They were just where I was, they're just the Steiner architects. There were like 3 of them. So then through that, I got to know about flow forms in agriculture because of the veggie stuff they had outside. And then I found eurythmy, and then in eurythmy, everything else came because Steiner links eurythmy to architecture, but not only that, to the gestures of geometry. So I wanted to extend these geometries I was working with in nature to people and to the energies, the energetic space it would create. So I found that through eurythmy. And then again, through another Steiner thing, it's called psychophonetics, where to analyze the psychology of sound and gesture in people. So it's quite nice because you've got this backdrop that's already all held together for you. So I'm very Steinery. It was a default, but yeah, I just keep finding more and more and more. And it's just beautiful, beautiful world and a beautiful set of skills to engage in. And the way it's taught.
Remember, it's a beautiful world because it doesn't always feel like that at this point in time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a great example for us, which he's brought because it educating through love. And like when the people learn maths, the kids, they go out and they learn all the geometries in the sunflower, or a parabola is actually the way the moon goes around the earth, and you can see it around you, and then eventually get to the hard stuff. So I think so much is hard and yang and gobbling us up, and it's a nice way to get back to being sensitive and being fed. And so it's there for anybody in whichever way, but that's what I got from it, and that's what's helped me to translate the tools of what's inside me to the stuff, to the outside, to the design, or how I'd like to engage, or what I'd like to bring, I guess. Yeah.
But you also have work with people like Rebecca Horn in her early performance pieces, which really become about describing space through movement, or Katsama even earlier 1970s, Helen Chadwick maybe, who are really using performance as a tool rather than as a discipline, which I think becomes this sort of in between spaces.
Yeah, I'm desperately scribbling everything down. But I also found, Laban, also apparently there's a whole world in Laban. And I went to the school, it's also amazing just to check it all out. And that's quite local. Laban, the Laban.
Yeah, of course. Totally.
Yeah.
No,
it's so rich, so yeah. And in the Bauhaus a bit, in their performances and their archetypes and everything.
Totally.
Yeah.
And really interesting stuff.
Yeah, just so rich.
Sam, thank you, Michelle. I can see, Sam, you've got your hand.
Yeah, so when we're going back conversation quite a while ago when we're talking about kind of dyslexic environments and what works best. So I've been out of mainstream school since I was 8, and I've been at 3 different special needs schools. And so what works best is, so how like a special needs school works is that, one, like everything is carpeted. You're trying to get rid of as much background noise as possible. You're trying to get rid of as much extra information that's in the room, as well as, there's always the classic, limited class size. So it's like 15 kids in a class. There's also, but mainly it's the teaching. Like in a classroom environment, it's literally the teaching and the eye contact and the movement of your peers and the teacher, and that communication. That's the most important part of it. And then also there's a point on what does someone who has autism or someone's dyslexic, what do they, and everyone reacts differently. At my school, everyone doesn't actually react the same to certain environments, but it's what the majority reacts to. And that's what's really hard. How do you try and specialize everything for everyone with every different thinking method or processing? I did for my GCSE, I did a project looking at my school and creating a safe space in my school. So looking at welfare and because we have lots of kids who have slight behavioral issues, and I was trying to create an environment for them that wasn't like S&T going to a classroom being told off. And I looked at color psychology and how that affected the mind. And I later on did a project for a competition for the RAF and BAE systems on looking at pilots and trying how to sort of not necessarily manipulate their minds, but kind of make them think in a certain way in the cockpit using color. So, the big obvious one is like using red to stimulate their mind to make them faster reaction, but using blue when they're doing night exercises, because that resets their 24-hour clock and makes it harder for them to fall asleep. And the great thing about that is color, you can start specializing for specific people, because there are over 7 million colors that the human eye can see. So it's, you can really start pinpointing this. And then once you get, further into it and look at, what smells affect people, how do they react to that smell? And then you can start creating these really interesting environments, to make people feel a certain way and help them calm down, or, what is the best environment for a creative mind? Like how, but the annoying thing is all different for everyone. So you can't always get it right. And it's that combination on, what works for you. But yeah, it was an interesting project to work on.
Sam, what are you doing now?
I'm at A level, so I'm lower 6th.
Right, and still still out of the mainstream education.
Yeah, I'm still yeah.
I think really, really interesting observations, and I would really agree with them all. We cannot design, everyone needs something different on one hand, but there are certain things we can do which really helps to trigger things along. So we can remove a lot of the chaos from the space, or having conduit running midway down the wall is really ugly, especially if it crosses windows. If we can remove all of the noise as much as possible, it starts to create a much more soft space. If we can maximize the light, natural light coming into the space, it really warms. And what natural light does is it changes as the day progresses. So as it moves from south to north, so from east to west, as it comes across, the space feels very, very differently. We can then arrange things so people don't spend too long staying in the same place. If both for your posture and for your psychology, to become static for too long is really detrimental. We can have spaces for different types of working. So spaces for standing and working, for sitting and working. We can make very big staircases where people will bump into each other. And then they are more likely to have a conversation, to encourage serendipity. We can make little sofas for 2-3 people where they can sit down and have an intimate chat, but don't feel that everyone else is listening to them. So it's just these small different collection of triggers and that we can put in there, little tools that we can add in order to change the process of the way that we're thinking and working. We can use color, we can use light, but we don't want to necessarily frighten people. We need to comfort them. That's not saying we shouldn't use bright colors. It's saying we need to be thoughtful in how we're doing it. For me, there's nothing worse in a briefing situation was when a client or a designer tells me they hate a specific color, because it needs to be about the role of the color and what it's doing. And we're not designing for one person, we're designing for anyone who's using that space, whether they're neurodiverse or whatever end of the spectrum they are, if we are accepting that everyone is on the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting project, and just look at how do people think. And
the other thing that I would say I really disagree with is this idea of learning difficulties. I think learning differences. I don't think you have learning difficulties. I have no doubt that you learn really well in many ways, but you just learn differently from whoever the woman at the beginning who sailed through school moving 150 miles an hour. It's just different, not difficult. It's difficult for us to work in their system, but it's not our system. But they work, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, also a question is, do you think design can be kind of predictable? Because right now I'm seeing everything starting to move into more of a welfare state of mind. We're starting to be more aware of our environment, but can we literally predict what's going to happen in design? Can we look back and go, well, what was the driving force back then, and can we see a driving force right now? We can look back and
we can see lots of different forces and lots of different influences. And we can look at certain architects and designers that come along and create different movements along the way. But I don't think we can predict. I don't think we can predict because people like you come along from a very different background and will do things in a different way, even if you're given the same brief. What's fascinating when you do briefs with students at different levels is how wide the responses are, which shows how unprogrammable the future is. Which I think is a really positive thing. Because in a way we can predict the future, it becomes slightly pointless to have a future. We want to discover the future, to smell it and to see it and to feel it. Hey, Eduardo.
Hi, how you doing? I'm an architect as well. And I think I have dyslexia. I think it's not diagnosis. But after this lecture, I think I'm gonna get the diagnosis. Now I'm making a master in between RCA and Imperial College, and it's been very difficult to make the things, So
you're doing engineering?
No, I'm not. I'm doing the master design and health.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And for me, that what is work is the standards. I work with the standards, and I always try to do the same things, and it's works for me. With the standard, and try to make all the things like the same during the day, and it's like it's been working for me. That sometimes it's a big problem with my wife because it's always more or less the same, but it's how I try to work. And before I used to live, I am Italian, but born and bred in Venezuela. So I have to have my own company, and I have a lot of help, like with accountant, number, editors. But now, since I arrived here, it's been like very difficult. It's like to find like my way here, because of maybe the language it's been difficult, and the way of doing here the things.
I think it takes a long time to get to know somewhere and a place. I didn't quite understand what you were saying at the beginning about making everything standard and everything the same, because I think in a way what we're talking about is the opposite of that, which is trying to celebrate moments and try to create rich moments in order to transform, particularly when you're working within. I know your course a little bit. I've taught on it a bit within.
Yes. No, but in my day life, I try to work like with, I don't know, like some things that have to be like maybe standards, not the word, but more or less the same way of doing. So it's been working for me, like
the same process.
But not.
What is the way of doing?
Like a process.
What is your process?
I don't know. I wake up. I don't know. I take a shower and that kind of things have to be always the same and eat in the same place and that kind of things.
A little bit OCD.
I always sit in the same place and that kind.
Yeah. Okay, I understand much more, but that's more related to OCD in a way, no?
Well, I don't know. I'm gonna check, but I think it's between dyslexia and OCD. My mother-in-law, who works with a lot of dyslexic kids, she said that I am dyslexic and I need the diagnosis. But before I didn't care.
The RCA is very good
about this.
Like I'm sure, like the AA, but they're very good at doing it. They're very good departments, and they're very good at getting people tested. So go and get yourself tested.
Yes, I'm going to do it with the Imperial College because I'm basically doing between the Imperial and the RCA. When I want to work on that, to have the diagnosis. Before I didn't care, It was okay. It was the way I do. But now I think I'm going to try.
Yeah,
with
it's
the
good
diagnosis.
to discover more about yourself.
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Good luck, and I might see you in the course.
Okay.
Yes, so Yusumbet, I think. Sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Yusumbet, you've got your hand up.
Hi, I'm Yumi from Venezuela, and I would like to ask if you can see the neuroscience or architecture or neuroarchitecture. I would like to put that name. It can help to heal people, Alzheimer patients, depression patients, and even ordinary people. If you can see or think that a space can heal people.
Of course, the space can heal people. I truly believe it. I think it's not a new concept. It's been around since 19th century. People have been writing about the effect of bad architecture on health, particularly in hospitals, sick, disease. The whole idea of taking people into the garden to get to get fresh air and to get vitamin D and to get UV on their skin and to smell the plants and the waking of engagement. The whole idea, the amount of papers on people going into hospital with one disease, fixing that and coming out with another disease, be that depression, be it a viral, having loss of appetite, a loss of energy. And you go, what church, I'm super atheist, but there's nothing more spiritual than going into an amazing church and seeing the way it's been designed around the path of the light, around the color, around the art, this space which is designed to really engage the human flesh. You go into it to a great space. You go and see James Turrell, and it moves you, and it's art It's the play between art and architecture and the anti-space. You go and see, spaces of great perfection, and they move your soul, and that makes you feel better. I'm always referring to the Bridget Riley's in the hospital in London called St Mary's on the 8th floor. She's taken over these 3 corridors, or the 6th, 7th, and 8th. Maybe it's the 7th, 8th, and 9th floor. And the simple painting really transforms the way you feel going into that space. And in our Maggies that we are everywhere, we have skylight pulling in, so there's always a sense of the outside coming in. Porosity, I think, is really important when we're talking about health. One of the problems in hospitals is you feel that you have very limited opportunities. So you need to be able to always feel that you can escape, that you can get out. The resistance of claustrophobia. People who have had chemotherapy are very, very sensitive to cold surfaces. So you want to have wooden handles. Now, health and safety will say wooden handles are more likely to get infection. But to date, no one's ever shown me a paper that really proves this is true. So I think it's an assumption, not a scientific fact. If you hear sound bouncing off every surface, it makes you feel ill. If sound is absorbed, it makes you feel much better. Care, so much of this is about designing fit for purposes, making care and attention to details, and working with love. It sounds a bit hippie, but it's really true. If things are cooked with love, they taste much better. If things are designed with love, the things are dealt with and resolved. The worst thing. Sorry, I was going to say the worst thing is that from a designer is the ego of the designer, because then it takes over the purpose. I want this thing to look like this huge, extravagant statement. What the fuck do? That's what we're really about. It's about the function. We're about making it fit for purpose and working. Now, one of those purposes is to give spiritual emotion to the user, then that's a really important part of it. But it should not be about creating a massive face for the architect or the client.
Yeah, and what can we do to translate that or transform? And you don't have to go to a church, but you can also have a meditation room, or your office can heal you because you have like 8 hours in your office on a daily basis, with pandemic, but or now in your home, you had your living room or your home office or your homeschooling. How can we
have your home? I think if you go back to the Ford Foundation in New York, I forget who designed it. It's not. Anyway, I'm allowed to forget who designed it because I'm dyslexic. It's fine. It's not Saarinen, but Saarinen used to work with them. And they feel the whole. It's immaculately detailed beyond belief. Everything is full of green plants and light and modular construction, and that is totally spiritual. Completely replaces the church. If you go into, my dad's airport in Baracas, when you arrive in that airport, you're spiritually moved by the structure, by the rainbow, by the kind of the welcome, the warmth and the welcomeness of it. It starts to form a threshold. What I'm trying to do, you go into the Cartier Foundation of Jean Nouvel in Paris, and you feel it's a powerful spiritual moment, which for me is very equal to the church.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Sorry. Sasha.
So just thinking about that healing element of design, I was actually talking to a gastroenterologist yesterday about the effect on like what we consume, so what we physically eat, and how that affects our brain. And he's done a load of studies on the gut health and Alzheimer's, and how replacing your gut microbiome can help heal your Alzheimer's. But we then got on to talking about consumption from a different perspective. So like your physical environment, what you're consuming in your space, what you're looking at, whether you're watching violent things on TV or whether you're sitting in a peaceful meditation room, and how that also contributes to your inner environment. So, which then, if your inner environment is in a negative way, then you'll be more prone to disease, which you can also break down to like living in dis-ease. So if you're living in a space that's not functional to what you need, like, for example, there was the girl saying she needs to be surrounded by lots of colors and patterns and things. Whereas if she was put in a minimalist environment, it might not contribute to what she needs to get inspiration, to feel comfortable. So that wouldn't make her feel safe. And therefore she would be living in dis-ease, which makes you more prone to developing these internal diseases. And the other is true as well, someone who needs calm and minimal objects around them. I think if they're then thrown into like a maximalist environment, or for example, someone who's an introvert forced to work in an open plan office where everyone can hear what they're doing, see what they're doing, and they feel like they're very exposed, and you consume negativity, or you create a very stressful space inside. So I think it's so interesting thinking about what the way that you design somewhere, that you consume everything that you look at, you consume everything that you touch, and that consumption then contributes to your inner environment much more than a lot of like scientific doctors will tell you. They don't even consider, a lot of people don't even consider consuming food to contribute to certain diseases, etc. But I think there's such an importance to the way that you design a space, or the way that you live in a space, that activates that parasympathetic nervous system, it's like where you need to be in order to heal.
But I think there's a few things which I would like to say, potentially. One is the importance that sometimes we work outside our comfort zone. So if someone is really, the person who was talking about loving to be surrounded by color, if you went and worked in a really white, beautiful space, she may find a very different effect, because you can start to build the colors in your own head. So you don't need the colors all around you. I think this idea that we should just be designing meditation rooms is a little bit crazy. We need to design beautiful spaces that we can meditate in, but we can also lie in, and we can do yoga in, we can eat in. You know, I don't believe in the home office. I believe in the kitchen table. When it's eating, it's a kitchen table. When we're working on it, it's a desk. They're both the same height. They're both flat surfaces. We've become too reliant upon taking all these objects with us everywhere we go as a kind of security blanket, and we don't so much need them. We have to work towards a kind of overlapping activities. So these things can all rotate. But a well-considered space is a well-considered space, and it can change and transform its functions. If a ceiling is 2.4 meters high, it will never become 3 meters. So for me, it's much more important to make strong bones, which we can then work inside.
Well, I think that's where the element of ease comes into it. That's where, no matter what the space, if it's well considered, then you feel there's like a sense of ease to move around it. It's sort of like the dance of the kitchen, where you have 5 people in the kitchen and everyone is seamlessly kind of moving around one another with ease.
Rather than stuck in the corner fighting to get to the cutlery drawer.
Exactly. There's a certain fluidity to that, which when you live in, or when you find yourself, or even just notice that you are living in that state, that kind of creates a sense of calm, which I think then contributes to a lot of internal healing, whether you're conscious of it or not. It just limits the amount of stress within your daily life, because so if you're trying to fight someone to get the cutlery drawer, for example, that will immediately activate a sort of stress, fight or flight response. Whereas if you're able just to move around one another with a sense of ease, even if, say, for example, you want to meditate, you don't have a meditation room, you're meditating on the floor in your kitchen. I think it doesn't matter that you don't have that room that's set for that purpose. It's that you are able to create the space that you need within whatever area that you are in. It's like that.
I want to go further and say I think it's irresponsible to design a meditation room, because you're meditating for maybe an hour a day. What that space then becomes void the rest of the day. We already have the bathroom, which is used, so we end up with all these very, very, very temporary, these spaces which are used for a very short amount of time. And I suppose I find it too too luxurious. We need to be able to program spaces to perform differently in the time. It's crazy that the gymnasium in the school is not used 90% of the day. So the gymnasium needs to become the lecture theatre, which it does already in many schools, it needs to become the dining space. So we can start to program these spaces in different ways. Why can't we meditate under the table?
Well, it's much easier to meditate in a space that's designed for meditation. Where it becomes challenging is when you are meditating next to a building site, for example.
But,
I think then that becomes,
and I work with quite a lot of meditation people. We're doing a centre at the moment, but that also becomes, if things are too easy, you miss out the journey. I suppose is what I'm trying to do. I really believe in tension. We need to build tension. We need to push barriers. We need not always to be, because though I agree with you what you're saying about disease, I also really think that we need to not patronize. We need to encourage thinking. We need to encourage serendipity. We need to encourage the unexpected to happen, and we need to make people we need to encourage people to be open to it, whether a child, whether a teacher, whether a client.
I think it's called adaptive intelligence. So, there's like a focus on IQ and someone's intelligence in that sense. There's adaptive intelligence is the ability to like evolve and change.
Of course.
I think, that's a really important thing to learn. And bringing that into the way that you approach your client, I guess, would be really interesting to sort of, because that adaptive intelligence is something that you can teach. Apparently, I was reading all about this. It's something you can learn and that can be taught, rather than this idea that intelligence is something that you either have or you don't.
I think also it can go further, and we could also program and play with it.
Yeah,
so it's not so transactional. It's going to be something which we can program into the space, which provokes that as an outcome.
Yeah.
We need to wrap up. Cass, were you going to say something just before we end?
Oh, basically, I guess going on the idea that you were talking about before about spirituality and designing from the soul. The dyslexic has a huge connection to episodic memory and empathy, and a huge amount of strengths in those areas. And that I just think in terms of future thinking about this concept about neurodivergent design is definitely rotating around that idea of designing from the soul is a pretty big idea, I think.
I absolutely agree. Again, Kaz, I find myself agreeing. For me, the last thing I'm going to say is I think the fascinating thing about neurodiversity is we are all so diverse. And diversity is the right word. And every time I sit with any of these panels, more and more I become aware of how different people are and respond to it. But we need to keep away from the cliches. We need to keep pushing the barriers, and we need to remove all the walls, and it will be fine.
We do, and I think to end on that note, doing it, practicing either architecture or whatever creative practice that one's doing in relation to bringing the senses to the forefront. I'm sure, Abe, when people, the family members who walk into Maggie's centres, who are accompanying their family member who needs the centre, and they're holding a door handle that's tactile as well. They're having an experience that's being brought to them that they weren't expecting as well. So there's the spectrum of people who are experiencing a closeness to tactility can only benefit everybody. I think that's something that we all long for, in a sense.
I think that goes back to what Kaz said, which is that what did you say about dyslexia and education? Education that's good for dyslexics is good for everyone. Something along those lines. I think it's the same. If you design with care for someone with a disability, it's really going to help someone who hasn't got a disability.
Exactly.
So we don't agree with the word disability. But,
it can only be a good thing.
You look at the Rem Koolhaas's Bordeaux house, which I think is one of his greatest projects, and it happens to be designed upon a person who uses a wheelchair, but it makes a better project for everyone.
Yes. Wonderful. On that note, shall we wrap up? Thank you so much to everybody for participating, for joining us, for your excellent questions. Thank you to Cass for joining us. That was an unexpected pleasure. Lovely to know more about Dyspla and to have you join us. Abe, as always, thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for your passion about this subject, bringing it to us. We've learned so much about it. Welcome you to the AA in person one day, just how we really want to see you.
Have a space.
Will be very nice in a teaching space in a room there. So everybody join me thanking Abe so much, and look forward to seeing you in person one day. Thanks, Abe.
Thanks, Abe.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Super.